this is fantastic. I have got Andromeda Turre here, and she's a singer, a songwriter, a composer, a pianist, an environmentalist, an activist, and she's got so many awards that if I listed all of them, I would never get a chance to talk to her. So, hi, Andromeda.
Hi, Richard. It's such a delight to be here with you.
It really is. And, I've got so much to talk to you about, but the first thing I want to talk to you about is the fact that we have so many similarities, uh, and we don't look alike, thank God for you. But we but we do have other similarities. Now, one of the things that you do, you're speaking about, is this thing called growing up jazz, which I think is really fascinating, and I'd
Hmm.
like you to talk about it. But the thing is, we both grew up with jazz parents and
Yeah.
with musical parents, and so I don't know how you feel about it, but a lot of people, I read interviews, I listen to people, and they say, oh yeah, well, my influences were I used to listen to this record and that record. But you and I grew up with this kind of thing, which is, for me, visceral, that, you see your dad getting up and playing. I mean, here's my dad here with a couple of
Oh,
guys,
yeah. People
Bob and
nobody's
Frank.
anybody ever heard of.
Yeah, those a couple of guys he always used to say.
Yeah.
But to see your parents performing, it's just emotionally, it makes you kind of want to be part of that. Tell me a little
Totally.
bit about you growing up with that.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. In fact, my first sort of interest in music was just dancing. I would go to my parents' shows and I was too young to really be able to participate, but I wanted to. Like, I just felt the music in my bones. And so I started dancing and I would go to the piano in our house and start playing and making music. My mom has cassette tapes. Remember those?
Oh, I do very well. I love them.
She's got cassette tapes of songs that I wrote when I was like 2 years old that I would make up. But there were always rehearsals happening in the living room, or I'd get picked up from school and we'd have to go to a jazz club for sound check, or my summer camp was going on tour with whichever bands my parents were playing with that summer.
Right.
And so I really, really loved it. And to be honest, because all of their friends were also musicians, artists, dancers, painters, creatives, I didn't know anyone really who had like jobs, like regular people
Yes,
jobs.
yes, yes.
And so it never really entered my mind to do anything different because that's what was modeled to me. And I loved it. And I
Hmm.
still love it.
Of course, when I was little, I couldn't take part in these things, but I had these guys jamming in the living room, and all these great players like Joe Venuti and Claude Williamson and all
Wow.
these guys playing in my living room. And
Yeah.
so I just heard it. I was mesmerized by it, and I wanted to be part of it. So how did you? I mean, you said you were dancing and tinkling on the piano, but what was the first time you started really seriously studying?
I started on piano. I started with piano. I studied with a gentleman named Cornelius Smith, and he was such a wonderful teacher for me. I actually just spoke to him a couple of weeks ago. I called him just to say thank you because he made sure that I learned like correct hand position and, different exercises and stuff. But I've always been very creative, and I think more strict models like a Suzuki method or something
Right,
might have turned me off because
right.
I just wanted to do my own thing. I watched a video of a piano recital. I'm about 5 years old. And I did start by playing whatever it was that he taught me. And about 30 seconds into the song, I just started improvising and making up my own thing. And he
Nice.
allowed me the space to do that.
Right,
And I think
right.
having him as a first teacher was really spectacular. So I started on piano and then I started singing in choirs.
Hmm.
And by the time I was in high school, I was in like five different choirs, and I also was in my high school musical theater program as well. So
Right,
that's sort of the
right,
trajectory that I came
right.
through.
And by that time, I'm assuming you could read, and I mean with the choir thing, they had
Yeah.
parts. I know that a lot of people in choirs kind of fake it that they can read, but they kind of just look at the notes, kind of go a little higher, and they know that, oh yeah, the melody goes there. But I mean, you actually were taught to read on the piano, I
On
assume.
piano, yeah, yeah. I learned
Yes.
to
Yeah.
read and notate on piano first,
Great.
and then I went to choir, so it was like it was easy to migrate over. And in fact, my my choir teacher in high school, since I could read in both treble clef and bass clef, and I
Nice.
have a wide vocal range, she
Mm.
would sometimes be like, all right, the first four bars you're going to sing the soprano line, but then we need you to jump down and sing the tenor line because they're
Right,
not getting
right,
those
right.
intervals right. And then
Yeah.
over here, I want you to sing the alto part.
Yeah, that's tough for me. I can manage treble and bass, but when it gets to alto, I just start thinking, I wish I had started
Yeah.
taking drugs. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was reading like scores in high school, which I now realize is incredibly unusual, but
Yes.
for me, it was really great, and I loved the challenge, and I feel like I learned so much in my childhood that it really set me up for life.
People say that certain things like rhythm and intonation are not teachable. And my dad used to always say, "Well, you can't teach somebody who sings out of tune." And I said, "Well, but in a way, they are being taught because you listening to your dad, and by the way, it's a trombone, excuse me,
Hmm.
and that is really you have to really know what you're doing and hear
Yeah.
it to be in tune because
Yeah.
it's a slidey, slippery, slidey instrument,
Oh yeah.
and so hearing that it's right all through your childhood, then you also can hear when it's wrong. So I think
Yeah.
that's a training in intonation, and also
Absolutely.
also with groove. I mean, your dad is not is not what I would call a guy who doesn't groove, and so therefore, you could tell that something was swinging or not. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about the first time maybe you got aware of this.
Yeah, my mom, I think, actually was the stickler with intonation. My mom is a cellist and she
Yeah.
has perfect pitch, which
Whoa.
is like a blessing and a curse, right? And
Yes, it
so
is.
I would be singing a song from the radio or whatever, helping her cook dinner. And she's like, "You're in the wrong key." And I'm like,
Wow.
my intervals were right, but I was in the wrong. Like she was always
Yes,
correcting me.
yes.
And she, when I was little, actually made me play the violin just
Right.
so that I could learn intonation and intervals in a certain type of way. I didn't
Right.
love it, so I never really got into playing the violin, but I really think
Mm.
that that helped to shape my sense of pitch. And I did a lot of singing just around the house and like driving in the car with my mom, because my mom, even though she's a cellist, she has a beautiful voice. And we
Right.
would sing and sing harmonies together and make up harmony parts to songs that were on the radio.
Wonderful.
And I think that that also really helped my intonation. And in terms of rhythm, like, when I was, I think, 6, 7, and 8 years old, my dad toured with Dizzy Gillespie in the United Nations Orchestra. And I went on tour with
Wow.
Dizzy with that band.
Wow.
And it was like, I mean, we got Giovanni Hidalgo on percussion. We got like you want to talk about rhythm. My dad was playing with like, Andy and Jerry Gonzalez. Like all of these rhythms were just sort of like passed on to me through osmosis just from the
Absolutely.
environment that I grew up
Yes.
in. And the swing, my mom was the founding member of Max Roach's double quartet.
Wow.
And so even when I was a baby, they were in rehearsals and doing that. I have a picture of me. I'm like, I don't know, 4 or 5 months old, Max Roach sitting in my living room holding me.
Okay.
And so I
You
think when you grow up, just being there because they had rehearsal. So I was just like sitting there while Max Roach was like playing in rehearsal with my mom, and he was imparting his rhythmic concepts to the string quartet as they were developing this double quartet concept.
wow.
Obviously at that young age I wasn't really like receiving the lessons, but I feel like through osmosis my sense of swing and my sense of rhythm were
Yes.
gifted to me, and I'm so
Yes.
grateful for that.
I think what you're talking about is exactly what I mean. You hear what's right a lot, and so then you know what's wrong. And it's like learning a language. You learn how
Yeah,
to speak English or Latvian or whatever language your parents speak. You hear it enough, and you're going to be able to speak it, and you'll speak with their accent. And then
totally.
then you start as you get older learning other accents and other languages, and that brings us very neatly, by the way, segues to the question of finding your own voice. Now, I know this is a
Mm.
subject you like to talk about. I want to start by saying that, you know, your ears get attuned to the tradition of jazz
Hmm.
and the music that came before. But when I was lucky enough to interview Wayne Shorter, he talked to me a lot about this idea that he has that jazz is what I say it is, what I say it is, not what somebody else says it is. And you know, jazz is I dare you. And he told me a story about Miles, who would say that he didn't want his musicians playing what he called duty jazz. Have you ever heard this thing of his?
What is
It was like
that?
I thought it's really interesting. It's what musicians feel it is their duty to play confirmation. You know, it is their
Mm,
duty to play these licks. You know, and it
right.
is their duty to play that stuff. And Wayne Shorter said, you know, obviously you want to learn that, but then who are you? And he was talking, I mean, because I was talking to him about trying to get him to talk about his incredible, mind-blowing compositions. And
Hmm.
he said it just came out of him being really more himself. And so what I want to ask you about is when the moment came for you that because what you're doing now is completely your own. You know, it's a very interesting, unusual kind of way to present the music. But it's, I mean, you know, I think everything is still jazz. You know, when
Thank
somebody
you.
walks across the street, it's still jazz. But I'd like you to talk a little bit how you developed your own thing.
I think that from a young age, being encouraged to have my own voice was a really great start. And of course, I learned the standards. There were, I remember I was 16 years old. For Christmas, my dad gave me a box set of every recording that Ella Fitzgerald had ever done for Verve Records. And
Nice.
he gave it to me for Christmas and said, transcribe this. It
Nice.
was like, okay, and I did. And
Wow.
so all of that language and all of those standards and the information and the way that she scats is all there. But I feel like, first of all, I'm never going to do Ella better than Ella. And
No,
we don't really need that. Like if you want to hear that canon, you can go get any of those recordings on that box set, and that
absolutely.
is reflective of that point in time, and that is
Yeah.
reflective of what Ella Fitzgerald had to say and had her style of presenting that music. I learned it as a way to gain vocabulary.
Yes.
I thank her for that.
Yes.
And now that I have this vocabulary, I can write my own story. And I think that I've always been around musicians who did that. I mean, even the ones that I just mentioned, Dizzy Gillespie, he was an
Oh,
innovator. Max Roach was an innovator. I
exactly.
don't know if you're familiar with Lester Bowie's Brass Fantasy. My dad played in that.
Absolutely.
Innovators, right?
Yes.
Rasan Roland Kirk. These are
Hell
all the
yes.
types of musicians whose music, Pharoah Sanders, right?
Yes.
Whose birthday is today, by the way.
Oh, really? Okay. Good.
Today's Pharaoh's birthday. And these are the musicians that inspired me. And it's a tradition that I think a lot of people forget about. A lot of people have this idea that jazz is only this nostalgic sound, this sort of 1950s jazz. It's the American songbook and these
Yes.
standards. And if it is
Yes.
not that and it is not swinging in a certain type of way, then
Yeah.
it is not jazz. But there's also a whole other tradition of jazz as protest music, jazz as speaking to issues and reflective of the times. In fact,
Yes.
you can go all the way back to the very beginning of jazz and listen decade by decade up until a certain point, and you can tell exactly what generation the music comes from based
Yes.
on how it sounds both in the repertoire, the styling, and
Yep.
what the lyrics of the songs are
Lyrical
talking about.
content, definitely.
And I
Yes.
feel like at a certain point, in a lot of ways with mass jazz, that has discontinued past a
Yes.
certain point. And they're like, okay, up until this point it was jazz, and from now on we just have to repeat this.
Exactly.
And the thing that frightens me about that is that I'm worried that jazz will become a a museum piece.
Exactly.
And it is a living art form. And again, the musicians that I grew up around really imparted that very strongly on me. This is a living art form. And in order to keep it alive, you have to keep adding to the conversation. And so I
Yes.
think it was very natural for me to look at the world around me and see what's happening with the environment and with climate
Yes.
change. And, I'm a mother, I've got two kids, being
Right.
concerned about the world that my children are going to inherit
Sure.
and wanting to reflect that because that's a huge battle of our generation.
Right. Right. And I think that you've hit it on the head with the fact that, you know, jazz has to speak in a language that is relevant to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times,
Hmm.
and some people can play beautifully in the style of the past, and they are, but and there are. It's lovely to have a museum piece there, but we already have the records, guys, and
Yeah.
once in a while you get players and singers who can sing that music in a way that's their own without ripping it apart and going bonkers.
Yeah.
They can still, I mean, certain singers that I hear singing that traditional thing are wonderful, and they do it so beautifully. However, there is a real need to do something else. I mean, I hate talking about myself, as you can see, but when I started my big band, I was deliberately, it was in the 80s, and, I was making lots of pop records and dance records, and I was using a lot of electronics. And I was using, actually, my first uh, album with my big band, I used electric drums just purposely to say, hey, wait a minute, we're here in the 80s now. This isn't 1947, and I love 1947, but,
Sure.
so let me see if yeah, look. Okay, so I made this record here, plug, plug, plug,
Awesome.
plug, 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 but it was with electric drums, and people hated it. I got incredibly violent reviews saying, "How can you do this to jazz?" I mean,
Yeah.
have you ever gotten that reaction to something that you're doing?
Every day.
Really?
Every
Yes.
day, every day. Yeah. Again, because I think it's also a systemic issue with also how jazz is taught and
Right.
how jazz history is taught. And it
Right.
is not necessarily being taught as an innovative art form. It is not necessarily being taught as, something that is reflective of each generation. They're just
Right.
have selected one generation to
Right.
reflect.
Right.
And if that is what you are taught, it's just like any other subject in the world, whatever perspective, if this is what you are banged over the head with,
Yes.
and then something comes and challenges that, it can be
Yes.
uncomfortable for people, it can make them angry.
Yes.
But I'm okay to be a disruptor.
Right. Right.
I'm okay to
And
be a disruptor because I love talking to people that are like, I had somebody who was my song Hydrosphere. They were like, "This isn't a jazz song," and I said, "Well, have you ever heard the Creator has a master plan?"
exactly.
Or somebody was talking to me about another tune on my record, Miss Margaret's Lament, which has
Right.
interview segments woven throughout it, and
Yes.
it's got
Yes.
a
Interesting.
a straight eighths feel on the drum. They were like, "This isn't a jazz song," and I
Mm.
said, "Well, have you ever heard Gil Scott Heron?"
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean? There are many, many artists from
Sure.
whom I drew inspiration
Of
for this
course.
album. And like, yeah, I drew inspiration from like Herbie Hancock on Earth Waltz and Wayne Shorter. Do
Sure.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
those are there too. But it's
Sure.
all a part of the language. I have all these Latin jazz tunes that are inspired by, Tito Puente. And
Of
there's
course.
just so
Of course.
much language that I have in my vocabulary that that's just how it came out, and I wasn't
That's right.
specifically trying to stick to anything. I really allowed the narrative that I was trying to convey to guide the composition.
Yes, and as a composer, as you are a composer, I mean, I as a composer use the language to convey the point that I'm trying to get across. I'm not interested in writing music that is purely technical or purely conceptual. What I try to do, and what I do as much as I can, is write with a purpose in mind to start with, and then use the language that is suitable for relating that purpose. And of course, you also have to think about your audience. If your audience is a bunch of very straight people who are traditionalists, well, you're not going to get very far anyway. But if
Yeah,
you, but for me, the art it's its own reward. It's because
absolutely.
if you feel when you finished a piece, this is it, man. Then I'm happy. You know, that for me that's enough. Now, if anybody else says I love that or I really get it, I get what you're doing, that's wonderful too. But
Yeah.
the first thing is I feel I've said what I meant to say.
And I'm so glad that you brought up the audience because I think that that's something really important to talk about. Because as I have created this album and I've sent it out to different venues, I've had more than one venue come back to me and say, "Oh, yeah, this is nice, but can you do like a Betty Carter tribute or an Ella Fitzgerald tribute or something like this?"
Right.
And it would have been an opportunity for me to perform. It would have been an opportunity for me to make a connection with a venue and to get in front of an audience.
Mm.
But I am very, very cognizant of the fact that my music and what my art is and what I'm trying to build
Right.
is probably not something that that super traditionalist audience is going to necessarily be really receptive to.
Right.
And I don't want to build that type of audience for myself
No.
because then I don't have an audience for who I am.
Right.
And it's taken me a lot longer to get to where I've been doing this for 20 years. It's taken me a lot longer to find my way
You
because I
started when you
didn't
were
go the
5,
easy
right?
route,
Yeah.
but I'm doing things my own way and I
Good.
have peace at the end of the night, right?
Yeah, and you certainly are. Hey, I hope you're enjoying this incredible interview. And if you want to help us talk to some more incredibly creative artists, subscribe to the YouTube channel, donate, and let us know what you think. Big thanks to everyone who supports our channel. And now, let's get back to the interview. And I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about the album now, From the Earth. You
Yeah.
guys out there in Radio Richard land, you really need to hear this because it's really a fascinating way to put together something. I believe you call it a jazz suite.
Yeah, it's a suite.
Yeah, well, it is sweet too. And
Thanks.
uh, um, there are a few things there's so much to talk about, but I'm just going to bring up a few things. First of all, well, the piano player is burning. Uh,
Oh,
that's one
he's
thing.
so good.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really true. And the finger on the trigger track. It's kind of, it reminds me of West Side Story. I don't know why, but you know, it reminds me of the fight scene in West Side Story.
A lot of people say that. It's harmonically, it's just a modified blues.
Yeah, yeah,
And
but that
I was
kind of
inspired by It's Time by
yeah,
Max Roach when I
yes,
wrote that. But everybody says it makes them think of West Side Story. And you know what? I love West Side Story, so I'm not at all offended by that.
yeah. And by the way, marimba is one of my favorite instruments.
It's so
Um,
beautiful.
and this Chen Lu, man,
She's incredible.
she's incredible. I played in a percussion ensemble when I was at Berkeley. That's another
Wow.
similarity between you and me. We
Yeah, we
both
both
went to
went to
Berkeley.
Berkeley.
But I played in a percussion ensemble which was led by Gary Burton, and
Wow.
so we had two vibraphones, two marimbas, uh, a xylophone, and a glockenspiel, and a
Mhm.
few other things, and then two guitars. And I was lucky to be one of the guitar players in
That's
it. And it
amazing.
was just so much fun. But I just kind of was fascinated by this resonance of the marimba. It's just such a gorgeous instrument.
It's a beautiful instrument. I grew up listening to Bobby Hutcherson, and
Oh
he's
wow!
got a really great album that he did on marimba called Linger Lane. My
Right,
favorite
right,
tune is NTU. If you haven't heard that song or you're not familiar with the album, check out NTU. It's
okay,
fantastic. And it
right.
starts with just marimba playing
Mm.
up front by itself. And I always really loved that song and that album. And I mean, who doesn't love Bobby Hutcherson? Like he was a genius.
Well, absolutely.
And
Eh,
so when I started to compose the suite, and I had interviewed these four communities that represented earth, sky, sea, and ice, I
Right.
wanted the colors of the music to reflect those biospheres. And so for
Mhm.
earth, you hear the marimba, the wood tones, you hear Richie Goods bowing the bass, right?
Oh,
These really rich tones. You hear the piano, you hear the didgeridoo. It's like lots of woody earth tones. And then you go into the sky and you have the harp, and you add the brass, and you have in the sea, which is the community was in Puerto Rico. So you have Latin percussion, you have my dad on the conch shells, and then
yes.
the ice, these metallic tones, the bell tree, the electronic, the iwi, right? The electronic
Yeah.
wind
Yeah.
instrument.
Right.
So each one of the or concertos, if you will, have a different sound. And the marimba really, I feel, glued together the earth section.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And of course you mentioned the conch shells. Now I absolutely adore that sound. And
Me
I've
too.
never seen anybody up close play it, and you have all your life. So I need to ask you. I mean, I've seen videos of your dad playing the thing, and it's fascinating to watch, but how on earth does it change notes? Is it, I mean, I can't see if there are any actual keys
There's
on it.
no buttons. It has to do with the amount of air that gets out. So when he puts his hand in, he's actually memorized for each shell, and he's got a bunch of different shells, how far he can put his hand in to change to get different notes. And you can
Yeah.
only get like a third, maybe a fourth interval for each shell.
Yes.
So he
That's, I see
uses
him
a
picking
lot.
up
That's why
different
he's always
shells.
switching them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, has he got some, I mean, I couldn't see from the videos, but has he got some kind of a stand where he has all the
Yeah.
different tuned kind? Wow. And then he just picks them up and puts them down again. Is that it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. That's exactly
That
how
is
he does
so
it. And he can
sick.
play two at once.
Wow. Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll send you a video. He can play two of them at the
Yeah.
same time,
Oh, good.
which he learned from when he was working with Rahsaan Roland Kirk. Rahsaan
I
could
was
play
just gonna say
three.
with this. Yeah.
So my dad can
Man.
play two at once, and then he'll put his hand in to even get
Uh-huh.
even more notes. It's wild.
It
And
really is
it's
fantastic.
definitely cool, but when you're a kid that doesn't want to wake up for school and your dad comes
Yeah.
in with the seashells, they're not
Oh
very
yeah, I see
cool.
what you mean. Yeah, yeah. Just, I'm being really selfish here, but has he ever played them as a section?
What do you mean?
Meaning in harmony with each other. In other words,
Oh,
"Boo-doo-wah," harmonized.
not overdub, but he had for a time in the 90s a shell choir where he
Right, right.
trained other people to play, and he
Yeah.
has all of these sort of brass like arrangements that he
Yeah.
did
Oh, I see.
of
Great.
both standards and original compositions that
Yeah.
are
Wow.
all shells, and it's
Man, I'd
beautiful.
love to hear that. Another thing that's similar about us is radio. You've
Yeah.
been, you're on Sirius XM and you're the person there, and I had a show on the BBC, various shows
Yeah,
for
so
20
cool.
years as a broadcaster, doing my own music biographies and lots of interviews with people. But one of the things that I feel about being a broadcaster is it gives you a chance to say, hey, I like this. Check it out. The thing I like about you as a broadcaster is, I like the idea of back announcing what you just played and also setting it up and telling them, I'm going to play you something really special. It's an elephant playing the trombone. So you're getting people interested. Then they listen to it more closely when you front announce it. And
Yeah.
and a lot of people tune in halfway through. So, and you do that too. So that's really great. Tell me about your feelings about radio.
It was really interesting. I never thought about doing radio. I didn't have a background in broadcast journalism, but my growing up jazz program that I have is a keynote presentation where I'm talking about jazz history and I'm talking about the music. And someone from SiriusXM ended up being at one of my growing up jazz presentations and was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about doing jazz radio? We're looking for hosts. You should apply." And I was
Right.
like, "Oh, that's really interesting. I had never thought about it." So I did apply, and obviously I got the job. And it's been a really incredible experience to share music and to make space for artists that I love. And of course, keeping the memory of so many great artists that have been,
Yes.
alive. Today being Pharaoh's birthday, I was on air for I think 5 hours, and every hour
Wow.
I played different eras of Pharaoh's music and
Wow.
shared that, and then played other artists that he collaborated with. Like I did a tune that he did with Phyllis Hyman, for example, which you maybe don't necessarily expect to hear on jazz radio, but it is a part of this canon. And
Yes.
then I
Yes.
also played, Cannonball Adderley and Miles Davis and,
Sure. Sure.
so
And
just spreading the love.
yes, you certainly do that. And tell me about when I was a broadcaster. I started doing my shows, and the BBC would give me a playlist, and I'd say no, no, I'm going to play my stuff. So did you ever have that thing? I mean, do they give you any kind of a playlist, or is it just you play what you decide on?
It's collaborative. I request every week what I want to play and
Yes.
whether it's specific artists or specific songs. And then the programming manager will, you know, most of the time I'll get to play what I want to play. And then there's
Yes.
songs that are in rotation
Yes.
and songs that they want to be played. And so it's a mix of
Right.
those. But
Right.
if there are things that I'm like, I really don't like this, I don't want to play this, they're
Yes. Yes.
usually pretty understanding.
Yeah. That's why I enjoyed listening to your shows, because it's always interesting, what you
Yeah,
play.
thank you. And I really try to make space specifically for women instrumentalists as
Sure.
well, because as somebody who listened to jazz radio well before I was working in jazz radio, I noticed that I heard a lot of female vocalists, but I didn't hear a lot of female instrumentalists on jazz
Yes.
radio.
Yes. That's
And so
true.
I really make an effort to, and there's so many great ones, like so many great female
They really
instrumentalists.
are.
So I really go out of my way to try to make space for them as well.
Yes, and I think the reason why there are more female jazz instrumentalists now than I think ever before.
Hmm.
Well, and I don't mean than ever before. I mean who are getting
Who are out there?
heard,
Yes.
who are getting
Yes,
heard
exactly. Yeah.
than ever before. It's because of broadcasters like yourself, and Terry Lynn Carrington does
Oh,
that as
yeah.
well. And so that's a good thing, because that balance has to be redressed, and you're redressing.
Trying to.
Now I'm going to ask the kind of devil's advocate question, because I know you are an environmentalist and you're really promoting the whole concept of it. Let me ask you what you actually think. I mean, you know more about it than anybody, but what do you think is the likelihood of an actual significant improvement in the environment?
I'm so glad you asked this question because I was talking about this with my dad just yesterday because we came across an article. We were like constantly sharing, we'll text each other about articles or whatever that we find interesting. And it was something that said something to the effect that if you can stay alive for the next 10 years, then you can stay alive for the next 50 years because of the advancements in technology and in understanding aging and combating
Yes.
things that, people die of old age and of different ailments. Like we're going to be
Right.
able to close that gap in the next 5 to 10 years, and
Yes.
people will live a lot longer,
Yes.
and even projected that humans could like double, triple their lifespans. And I said to my dad, I think that might be the only way that we can actually get some movement because there's a very small group of people at the top who are doing the most damage.
Yes.
Like me switching to paper straws and driving an electric car is helping on a macro level, but on a micro level, on a micro level, but on a macro level, there's a small group of people who have a lot of resources and who are doing a lot of damage. And they
Yes.
don't care because they're like, well, I'm not going to be here when the planet goes to hell.
Yes.
However, those will also be the first people that have access to this longevity technologies.
Correct.
And if those people are like, well, shoot, maybe I do care if the Maldives are underwater because I like going to the Maldives and I might want to go there in 100 years because I'll still be alive.
Right.
If we can get them to live longer, they might actually start caring
Right.
about how the planet is, because that might be the only way we get some change. So maybe it's a little bit of a conspiracy theory, but
Right.
that was a conversation that I just had yesterday with my dad.
Well, and I'm glad you related it, and I must say I wasn't expecting that answer, but I'm glad I got it because a lot. I mean, of course, obviously, I'm right behind everything that you're saying about the environment, but it's really when you look at what governments, corporations, and just wealthy idiots are doing to the planet
Yeah.
uh, without any care, and the whole political situation in the whole world now is moving in ways which two subjects I don't talk about is religion and politics,
Yep.
but nevertheless it's scary out there.
It's
So
scary out there.
yeah, but your answer is really one I wasn't expecting, and I was very glad to get, and I'll do my best to live for the next 10 years if I can.
Yeah,
um,
same. And you know what? I do think that, the latest science and data does show that it is not too late, and that if we can lower emissions by a certain point, I'm not going to get the numbers right, but it was like 100 million people are going to have to immigrate if we keep going at the pace we're going with our CO2 emissions
right.
from Southern America. Like,
Yeah,
look how Florida just got destroyed, right? Those people are all
exactly.
going to not be able to live there and they're going to
Right.
have to move up. But if we're able to bring our emissions down, it'll go down to like 20 or 30 million.
Right.
It's still a lot of people. But if you
Yes.
think about resources and strain, think about where it is that you live right now. If 20 million people came to live there versus 100 million people came to live there, it's a huge difference. So while I think to a certain degree things are irreversible,
Yes.
I think there are still things that we can do to mitigate and safeguard the complete collapse of society. But
Mm.
everybody has to get on board and we have to work together.
Yeah.
And humanity has to be more about love and less about greed.
Oh boy.
And that's one of the missions behind my composition, Critical Mass. If you
Yes.
notice with that tune, it gets faster and faster and faster and faster and
Yeah.
faster throughout. And that's because our need to take action becomes more and more and more and more immediate. And
Yes.
the
Yes.
tune Critical Mass is called that because we need a critical mass of humanity to really get on board and
Yeah.
be interested in change.
Yeah.
And it starts with a seed of love and not just this very narcissistic, greedy mentality that has permeated humanity right now that I would love to see go away.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think a lot of the reasons why you talk about this particular subject is because the way you grew up, and
Yeah,
the parents that you have. Because I mean, I know a lot of people who just, as you said, don't care,
they don't
and they
care.
don't care because they were brought up in an environment of greed and don't care and just take whatever you can and to hell with everybody else. And
There's an
so,
absence of love in that.
and I think also, you don't need to have you need to have a license to have a dog, but you don't really have to have a license to have kids. So therefore, there seem to be no rules. It's whatever way you want to bring people up, and
Yeah.
if you bring them up in a feeling of violence and hate, there's no way to stop people doing that. But you have been spreading the love in a big way, and in every way, in all the facets of your career. You have your head in the clouds. That's definitely
I
true.
always do. My husband
Ah.
says that all the time, that I have my head in the clouds.
Oh, he's right about that. And I love what everything that you've said, and I love the stories about your dad and mom. I would love to meet them.
Radio Richard!